Good afternoon, welcome, bienvenidos. I am just privileged to have Ruth with me. I met Ruth in 2000 when she came to give a lecture at Tulane and Loyola Universities, and I interviewed her for my column, Nuestro Pueblo, in the Times-Picayune. And I was just so thrilled when they told me that she had accepted to come and speak in this great literary fest. So welcome, Ruth, bienvenida.
Thank you.
We are just thrilled. Please have a big applause for Ruth.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's so nice to be here. First of all, it's so nice to see you again, Anna. This has been such a pleasure. It's so nice to be part of the New Orleans Book Festival, to be here at Tulane University, and really among friends. And I'm falling in love with New Orleans and hope I can come back very soon. Thank you.
Okay, it's our pleasure, I know. Anyway, before we talk about her new book, Across Many Seas, which I just recently, yesterday, she gave a wonderful talk about the community, the Jewish community of Cuba, to a synagogue. And I learned that the book is translated to Spanish, which is amazing. It's great. And she knows about some of the Latino organizations here in New Orleans. And she said, well, now my book is in Spanish and maybe can be accessible to the kids in the schools that they are still not very proficient in the English language. So I just thought that was wonderful. But before we go into her book, I would like Ruth to maybe give us a little brief background of her history, because her identity, her family history, and her experiences are all projected into her books.
Yes, thank you. Well, something that I often say, how's the volume? Is this good for everybody? Okay, good. Something that I often say is that I'm Jewish because I'm Cuban. So those two identities are really inextricably linked for me. And so you know that I was born in Cuba. My parents were also born in Cuba, but my grandparents on both sides of the family were immigrants. On my mother's side, they came from Eastern Europe, from Poland and Russia. On my father's side, from Turkey. Sephardic immigrants. So I had the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic mix with my grandparents. So they found a refuge in Cuba in the 1920s, in that period right before World War II, when many Jewish people were seeking refuge somewhere else. And it was a time when it was very difficult to enter the United States. There was a quota system enacted in the 1920s, so many Jewish people who wanted to immigrate in that period couldn't come to the United States, but Cuba at that time was open, and so many, many immigrants went to Cuba, and that's how my family ended up there. And of course, in a time before the internet, they just heard that if they got to Cuba, it was so close to the United States that they could practically swim over. So many went to Cuba thinking, okay, we'll go to Cuba, and then from Cuba we'll come to the United States. But what happened was that many of these Jewish immigrants, like my family, felt very at home in Cuba, and they decided to stay. And they stayed until the early 60s, most of them, who left after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, when there was a nationalization of property and the loss of private enterprise. And so that was the period in which many in this Jewish community chose to leave for the United States. And I was part of that migration. I was 5.5 when we arrived in New York. I grew up in New York, so I'm a Cuban New Yorker. But we had family around the 70s. Half of the family said, we don't like this cold weather in New York. And so about half of the family moved to Miami in the 70s, aunts and uncles and cousins, and then eventually my maternal grandparents also went ahead and retired in Miami. So I always had this connection between the Cuban community in New York, the Cuban community in Miami, kind of grew up between those different communities, but always very aware that I was Jewish, that I was Cuban, that I was Latina, that I had this mix of identities being both Jewish and Latina, and then as a Jew also having this mix of identities of being both Ashkenazi and Sephardic. And I think that's what led me to want to study anthropology and to live in Spanish-speaking countries, which I did for a very long time. I've lived in Spain and Mexico, and I've gone back to Cuba many times. I spent some time in Buenos Aires also teaching. anthropology there. So the travel was very, very important to me. And I also was able to go to the places where my grandparents were from, and I spent some time visiting Poland and visiting Turkey as well. So going to the places was always a very important part of my history for me as an anthropologist. And then more recently now, I've started thinking about these experiences in a more imaginative way and writing fiction.
Thank you so much, Ruth. And I wanted to ask you, when did you start writing, and what or who inspired you to be a writer?
Yeah, so I started keeping a little notebook when I was about 11 years old. I don't know if any of the young people here today, if any of you keep a diary, any of you? You keep a diary, and I had one of those diaries with a little key that I could lock up my diary, and I liked locking up my stories in the diary. It was like writing about my secrets. I think that's what started the desire to want to write. I wanted to write down the things I didn't want to share with anybody or tell anybody, but they were important to me. So I wrote them in my diary, and then I locked it up with the key. So that was, I think, how I started. And then in high school, I had a really wonderful Cuban-American teacher who taught literature, and she introduced me to a lot of Latin American literature, to Garcia Marquez at the time, and to Jose Marti, the great Cuban poet, and other literary greats in the Latin American tradition. And because I was Cuban and she was Cuban, and this was a Spanish literature course, she really encouraged me to talk in Spanish more, to write in Spanish, and I think that was a very important inspiration for me to want to become a writer.
Also, I found it very interesting yesterday at the talk at the synagogue. You referred to the accident you had, and I think this would be very significant for the young people who are here today.
Yeah, so what happened is shortly after we arrived from Cuba to New York, we lived in Queens. My father was very excited to get a car because he didn't have a car in Cuba, and he dreamed of having a car. So he bought a car, and then we used it a little bit, and then unfortunately we were in a terrible car accident in New York. For those of you that know New York, it was on the Belt Parkway. It was a really terrible car accident, and I ended up with a very severely fractured right leg, and I was placed in a body cast, and I had to be in bed for close to a year, and the cast got changed several times. But the cast was put on both legs so the legs would grow evenly, because I was 10 years old and the doctors were afraid that the legs wouldn't grow evenly unless both legs were casted. So I had to be in a body cast, and it was a very terrible experience, but it was also an important experience in my life because it made me who I am today. That was the time in my life when I started reading a lot and becoming very contemplative, because I couldn't move, I couldn't get out of bed for such a long time. And one of the things that was so amazing was that my public school in Queens, New York, sent a tutor to teach me, at home, because I couldn't move. And we always thought that was so amazing that they had been so concerned. And she brought me many, many books. And that was when I really started reading. And I think, coming back to your earlier question, wanting to write and just being so amazed by the way a book could transport you to a whole other world. So I think that had a lot to do with who I am today. But the book that came out of that experience, it's a middle grade novel, and it's called Lucky Broken Girl. So it's about a girl who's lucky in a way because she's being introduced to this whole world of books and literature, but she's also broken, and she has to figure out how she's going to heal and how she's going to put herself together again. So that was the first novel that I wrote for young people, and it really came out of my own experience very, very strongly, but also remembering what it was like for my mother and my father as new immigrants in New York, what it was like to start a whole new life in a new place.
Now, can you tell us, in recent years, though, I read most of your books for elderly people, for all ages, let's put it in that way. But in recent years, you started writing more for young people, and can you tell us why?
Yeah. So most of my career, I've been an anthropologist, and I still teach anthropology. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan. So I've mostly written nonfiction, and most of my writing has been based on interviews and observation of people, so very documentary-focused work. But about 10 years ago, I just had always wanted to write fiction and started writing this first book, Lucky Broken Girl, in the voice of a 10-year-old girl, because I really remembered what it was like to be 10, 11 years old, because that experience was such a strong and vivid experience. It like really marked me. So I just started by writing that story in the voice of a 10-year-old girl, not knowing exactly what I was going to do with it, but just remembering that time in my life, and what I didn't remember, I invented. So it was a mix of memory and invention, or reconstruction. And that's how it started. And when I finished writing that book, I realized that it was a book for young people, that it was written in such a way that it was meant for young people. And I was able to get it to an editor who focuses on books for kids. And she was so impressed. She said, "How did you get that voice, that 10-year-old voice so well?" And I said, "Well, I think I just lived that moment in my life very, very vividly, and it just never went away." And I love writing from that perspective.
Okay, well, I love the book A Través de los Años, or Across So Many Seas, if you want to show both editions.
Sure. Yeah.
And what inspired you to write this epic novel, the saga of 4 girls from different generations of one Jewish family? And can you share with our audience why you chose the age of 12?
Yeah, well, let me start with that. So I chose the age of 12 because in the Jewish tradition, 12 is an important age for girls. It's the moment, it's the cusp of adulthood, just like 13. 13 is for the bar mitzvah age, and 12 is the bat mitzvah age. So I thought 12 was a significant moment for young girls, and so wanted them to each be 12 years old. And then the book was inspired by 2 things. On the one hand, I wanted to write about the expulsion of the Jewish people from Spain in 1492. It's such an important part of our history, and when we think about 1492, we usually think about Columbus and the conquest of the Americas, but we forget that there's this other 1492 that had to do with expulsion. So I wanted to really understand that period of time and what it would have been like to be a young person and be experiencing an expulsion where you're being told, okay, you only have a few months left. If you want to hold on to your faith and your religion, then you're going to have to leave your homeland. But you also have the option of converting to Catholicism and staying. And so I thought, what would that be like to be 12 years old and experiencing this, and seeing this cataclysmic change in your life? So that inspired me on the one hand, and then on the other hand, I was inspired by my grandmother. So I had written an earlier book about my maternal grandmother, the grandmother from Poland, called Letters from Cuba, or Cartas de Cuba. And then this book I decided to write about my paternal grandmother, my abuela, who was named Rebecca. And so she had a very, very interesting story. And she was sent to Cuba from Turkey as a young girl by her parents. And her 2 sisters and brother stayed behind in Turkey, but she was sent off to Cuba by herself. And the story we always heard was that she was sent on an arranged marriage, but then she got to Cuba, and the person she was supposed to marry had married someone else. So what was she going to do? So fortunately, there was an uncle who took her in. And then the other part of the story is that she sang these old Sephardic songs, these old melancholy love songs in Ladino, in this old Spanish. She sang the songs, and she played an oud. An oud is a Middle Eastern instrument spelled O-U-D, like a lute or a mandolin. So she played the oud, and the story goes that she brought an oud with her from Turkey to Cuba. And then she played the oud, and she sang songs. She was staying with this uncle. She would sit in the doorway and sing. And that was how my grandfather apparently was attracted to her, and through her singing and music and so on. And they married, and they were never very well off. They lived right near the port of Havana in a tenement. And but after she married, she had 4 children, among them my father, who was the 3rd child. And then the story goes that she stopped playing the oud. The oud hung from a nail on the wall, and she just stopped singing. And I was just so moved by that story, and that inspired me. I had to figure out or come up imaginatively with a reason why this girl was sent to Cuba and what would happen to her. afterwards. So that was the other, so there was this personal inspiration, and then there was this historical inspiration.
Well, that answers my next question, because I was going to go to how wonderful your book brings all the culture, the traditions of the Sephardic Jews. And also there is a portion in the book where you will see one of the girls that Ruth portrays plays the oud, and that answers my question why you chose music and poetry as expressions that these girls felt that they were so necessary and important for their living. So
yeah, absolutely. Just knowing that my abuela, was so connected
Yes.
to the poetry and the songs.
Yes.
But also because Sephardic traditions are often passed on through music and song and poetry and proverbs. Those are the spaces where the culture and the heritage is so often passed on.
of course, speaking Spanish, I just love the names you chose for the
I
four
know.
girls
I
in
love
your
that too.
book. One is Bienvenida, the girl who was left in 1492 Spain. Then Reina in Turkey, Alegra in Cuba, and Paloma in Miami. Can you elaborate on that or why you chose those names?
Yeah, well, I think names are really important, and I chose them, some of the names, just because I love them, and then after I chose them, I realized there are good reasons for these names beyond the fact that I love the names. But Bienvenida, so Bienvenida is Bienvenida in contemporary Spanish, and that means welcome. So I thought it was interesting that the first girl, who is the girl who lives in 1492 in Toledo, Spain, she's named Bienvenida. Her name means welcome, but she's no longer welcome in her homeland. So it has this ironic meaning that she's called Bienvenida. It was also a common name in the 15th century, common name for Sephardic girls. So that was one reason to choose her. And then Reina also is a very common name, also among Sephardic Jews, but I liked it because it means queen, and I thought she's kind of a queen she's been expelled. Well, you have to read the book to find out, but she's kind of expelled from Turkey in my version of
You
it.
cannot tell them all
No, I can't
because
tell
they
them
need
all.
to read the
no,
book.
you need to read the book. And well, one of the things I should say about writing the book is that I had the idea of a book that would be about four girls living in four different time periods in four different places. So I knew that much when I started, but I had no idea how the four stories were going to connect. So I was writing these four stories and thought, I hope they're going to connect. But they do, but you have to read till the very end of the book to find out how. So Reina is kind of this queen without a kingdom. She's a queen without a kingdom. Then we have Alegra, which means happiness, and she's kind of the opposite of her mother. Her mother is Reina, and she's the one that's like seeking happiness and joy, but then also finds sorrow unexpectedly at the end of her section. And then we go to Paloma, who's the last girl who's living in Miami in 2003, and she's the contemporary girl who's inherited all of this tradition and heritage and is trying to figure out, what do I do with all of this? What made me, and now what do I do? What do I do with all this history? And so she's Paloma, which means dove, and she's kind of the dove of peace. She's connecting everybody, and she brings the family back to Spain, where the story begins. So there's also that element of it, too.
Well, I have to say that while reading the book, I just became so immersed in the story of I became each of those girls, And I love that you infused in each of them, even that they lived in different periods of time where it was not heard of women getting an education or anything. They have an enormous sense of independence.
Yes.
Would you like to say something about that?
Yeah.
Because most of your books have a very feminist tone.
Yeah,
So.
they do.
Yes.
And I'm proudly a feminist, if I can still call myself that in this day and age. But so absolutely, all the girls are seeking independence, freedom, a sense of who they are, a sense of their identity. That's all extremely important to me in the book. And in each period, you see the limitations of what's possible in that historical moment for a girl to achieve, and they're all kind of trying to come up against those boundaries and see what they can do. That's definitely a big theme in the book. Yeah.
One of the parts that I enjoy the most, and I guess it's because I visited Cuba in 2005 to deliver medications that they were so short of those. and also because I have lots of Cuban friends. Some of them are here in the audience, and they all had to flee Cuba. But I was really fascinated by the contrast in Alegra's life as a brigadista. And I don't know if people know what a brigadista is, but they were the young people who taught literacy in the countryside to people who didn't know how to read and write. And I just found that portion extremely fascinating because I didn't know much about that. But the contrast between her, that she's willing to do something for the new government, for Fidel Castro, but then her father is a big opposer to those ideas. So the contrast between her willingness to do something because of her friends also, and her father's ideas, and then her exodus to Miami all alone. So how did your own experience or your family's experience in Cuba influence this part of the book?
Yeah, so that was a really exciting part of the book to write. Now, I left Cuba very young, so I didn't really get to experience much of what happened after the revolution. But I was always really curious about that literacy campaign, which was fascinating in 1961, where Fidel Castro was able to organize all of these young people, thousands of them, who most of them were from Havana and other cities, and they went off into the countryside to teach people how to read and write. And literacy and reading and writing is a big theme in the book as well, from the first girl to the last girl. So I wanted to bring that in, the importance of reading and writing, but also understanding that the politics of it and the ways in which things also went sour as well, even with like the most well-intended projects like the literacy campaign. So I wanted to kind of show the complexity and the nuances of that, but also show this girl who was innocent and idealistic and hoping to do something good for her country, and then unfortunately having to leave when it turns out that her father is arrested and gets in trouble for being against the revolution.
Right.
And then she ends up leaving Cuba through the Pedro Pan operation, and this was a movement where like 14,000 young Cuban people, Cuban minors, were sent out of Cuba in that period. And I actually had a cousin. There weren't many Jewish Pedro Pans, but there were a few. And I actually have a cousin who was sent out through Pedro Pan. So I kind of had her in my mind as I was writing the story of Alegra and how Alegra gets out of Cuba.
Well, I have several friends here who came through Pedro
Who came
Pan.
through Pedro Pan,
Yes.
yeah.
So anyway, also I noticed in your book some universal themes such as intermarriage, the challenges of adolescence, the fascination of new immigrants with the new country and the new things that they find, but also their nostalgia for what they left behind, which is very much a common attribute of most immigrants. I experienced it too when I came to this country, fascinated with new things, but missing the stuff, missing all my friends and everything else, and some of the characteristics of my life in Argentina. So what I was going to tell you is, can you comment on this? Because this is important. These themes are so important. They're still important today. And they affect not only affected the Cubans or affected all these girls, but they affect the new migrants here in this country as well.
Yeah, well, that's a really beautiful question. I think nostalgia is such an important topic for thinking about immigration. And I think with Cubans in particular, at first they thought they would be going back, because they thought, well, this government isn't going to last. This communist government in Cuba is not going to last. So we're probably just here temporarily, was what a lot of Cubans thought in the early years, in the 60s and so on. And so because of that, they really held on to their memories, and they really held on to Spanish. And Miami is a city that really was innovative in bilingual education because, again, they wanted their kids to speak really good Spanish in case they went back to Cuba. And so there was this assumption that we were probably going to go back at some point. And then it became clear that probably wasn't going to happen. I mean, we could go back and visit, but most people who had left were not going to go back. So I think there's something special about that Cuban nostalgia because, so many immigrants eventually do go back or have a back and forth relationship with their country. And some Cubans do, but it's not the general position. It's not the same. And so I think nostalgia was very important. And growing up in New York, listening to all the stories of Cuba and going to this one restaurant that we went to almost every week in Queens. I don't know if anybody here
Yeah, tell
knows.
them. I think that's
knows.
funny.
Well, there's two restaurants I'm going to mention. Rincon Criollo, does that ring a bell to any New Yorkers who might be here? Well, this is a restaurant in Queens. It actually now moved to Long Island, but we would go there almost every week to this restaurant, and literally, like, Passover would end, and then it's like, let's go to Rincon Criollo now. So there was always this kind of connection to Cuban food and Cuban culture, dancing. My family always had, cha-cha-cha music on, and, Cuban culture, and Celia Cruz, who also appears in the book, her music was so important. So there's always this connection to the music, the culture, the food, the language, all of that. There was always this sense of, Cuba as this, beautiful place that we had to leave behind. And I think all of that really informed, my sense of identity. And then eventually my desire to go back to Cuba when I started going back and forth in the 90s and getting to know the Jewish community there and getting to know writers and artists in Cuba and really connecting, with that part of my identity was really important. But it had to do with the fact that I was always hearing about Cuba, from my family, from the extended family.
I had a good taste of that because the first year we came to the United States, we lived in Miami. And so we were just fascinated, the Cuban food, the Cuban restaurants in Calle Ocho. It was the cheapest way to eat also for us, that we didn't have any money. So I acquired that taste for Cuban food. I love Cuban food, and Cuban music and everything else.
Yeah.
And many things I was not acquainted with, like some tropical fruits that are not characteristic of Argentina, for example. So that's one of the changes that when you adapt to a new society, it happened to us, to learn, like, for example, we moved here and everybody was crazy about chili, and I didn't know what chili was. I had never had chili in Argentina. So, so it was quite a new experience, one of the new experiences that, well, now let's go to kind of the end of the book, where you tie up everything, and I'm not going to tell you anything about it because that's the juiciest part of the book, and you have to find out by yourselves. But having been in Toledo, learning about the Sephardic experience, I have been there several times. That last part drew tears from my eyes.
Thank you.
And it drew tears because the first time I went to Spain, I did not know anything. I mean, I knew about, the Jewish traditions in Spain and all that, but I did not visit the sites that were that important, and nobody, was there to give us a tour. This was many, many, many years ago. I don't want to reveal how many, but anyway, the third time we went, we went specifically to Spain and Morocco to find out about the Jewish traditions and what had been left of that. So I visited, of course, the synagogues, the Sinagoga del Tránsito that you referred to in your book, the Santa Maria la Blanca, and it was like story was jumping onto me from the walls when I saw all the Jewish signs and the Jewish writings. It was a very, very moving, experience for me. And I would like to hear about your experience when you lived in Spain, and also I want the people to know that your name Behar comes from the city of Behar, which is written differently, B-E-J-A-R, which is in Spain.
Yeah, no, this is all incredibly fascinating to me, this topic. So my name, Behar, which is my father's name, I never changed my name when I married, so I have my father's name, and it's Behar with B-E-J-A-R with an accent on the E, and it's a town near Salamanca. And so I did my first field work in a small village in northern Spain, in León, and that was in the late 70s, early 80s. And at that time, there wasn't that much interest yet in the whole Sephardic history in Spain. But in the last few years, there's been growing interest, and you can go to Spain and follow the Camino de Sefarad, which is the path of Sefarad. And it's 22 different cities and towns that are linked to this path. And these are all cities, towns where there's some sort of Jewish trace left, whether it's a mikvah or an old synagogue or a Jewish home. So archaeologists in Spain have been very active in uncovering the traces of the Jewish past in Spain, and they go back to the medieval period, and it's really amazing. So one of the most amazing, kind of the Mecca, well, let me just pause here and go back to Behar. So I went to the town of Behar back in the 80s going, I wonder if this has anything to do with my last name. And at the time, there was yet no research done on this in the town of Behar. But then years later, about 10, 15 years ago, they started excavating and finding more information about the Jewish presence in Behar. And eventually, they actually opened a Jewish museum in the town of Behar, which is very, very interesting. And one of the interesting things that's in the museum is I made a documentary about the Sephardic Jews of Cuba. It's called Adiós Querida, Goodbye My Love. And since I made it 20 years ago, it came at first in a video cassette format, if any of you remember what a video cassette is.
But I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful documentary.
Yeah, you can see it on Vimeo now,
Yes,
but at the
yes.
time it was a video cassette. And so in that Jewish museum in Behar, there's a glass case, and inside the glass case, there's the video cassette of Adiós Querida. So it's kind of interesting. So I've been archived. So that exists in Behar. But as I said, there are 22 towns and cities. And then in Toledo, we have, as Ana just said, what used to be the Sinagoga del Tránsito, and that is now the home of the Sephardic Museum of Toledo. And it's really an amazing place. I mean, you go there, and it used to be a 14th century synagogue. And somehow, though the building was used for many, many things throughout the centuries, somehow the inscriptions that were underneath in Hebrew and in Arabic, the beautiful work that was etched onto the walls, all of that still remains. They were able to uncover all of that work. And so I thought it was so interesting that there's this Jewish space inside a museum in Spain today, and that's why the end of the book takes us to this museum. So the book begins in the city of Toledo with this girl Benvenida leaving Toledo, and then ends with this kind of return to Toledo with Paloma and her family so many centuries later.
Thank you, Ruth. I thought it would be interesting for those who are not aware the difference between Ladino and Spanish. For you to say something about that.
So Ladino is really its own language, and now there's a whole movement to revitalize Ladino. If you want to find out more about this, there's an organization that just began, and I'm on the advisory board, called American Ladino League. So Ladino, or Judeo-Español, as it's also known, or Judeo-Spanish, is really interesting because Spanish became a Jewish language for Sephardic Jews, just like Yiddish is a Jewish language for Eastern European Jews. And so it's the Spanish that was preserved from the time of the expulsion from the 15th century, and it's the Spanish that Sephardic Jews kept speaking, which is fascinating because they were no longer in Spain, but they loved the language so much, they kept speaking Spanish, but then they moved to various parts of the world. They were part of different diasporas, and so some moved to Greece, and to what is now Greece, what is now Turkey, Morocco, and so it's Spanish, but combined with other languages that have been added in during the course of the centuries. So it may have some Arabic, some French, some Italian mixed in, some Turkish mixed in. So it's kind of Spanish with other accretions of other languages mixed in. But the interesting thing is if you speak contemporary Spanish and you speak to someone who's never lived in a Spanish-speaking country but has held on to Ladino, you can completely understand each other. It sounds like they're speaking an old Spanish, but it's completely comprehensible. So certain words are different. So if the word comprar that we use in Spanish today, to buy, the word in Ladino is mercar, which is an old Spanish word for to buy. Yeah.
Yes. So yes, it's easy to do that. And also when you read it, the letters, it's in Hebrew.
Yes. So
the letters are
the
Hebrew
alphabet
letters, but when you read it, sounds like Spanish.
Sounds like Spanish.
Yes.
Though now it's also written in the Roman alphabet. And the interesting thing is that the K is used instead of the QU. So like Adiós Querida, we use the K for querida instead of QU. So in the transliteration into contemporary the Roman alphabet, we are using the K instead of the QU to also mark the language as different from Spanish.
And one last question. You dedicated this book to your grandmother, which you already talked about, your paternal grandmother, Rebecca. And there is a lovely picture of her grandparents in the book, and also to your granddaughters, who are 1 and 3.
Yes.
And what do you hope that your granddaughters learn from this book?
Well, I hope they'll read it one day. That's number one. They're very young. I don't think they can read yet. One is 3 and the other one is 1. So my 3-year-old can already write her name. So we're getting there very quickly. But I'm hoping that they'll read it, that they'll realize that this is part of their heritage. And yeah, just kind of passing on the history to them, honoring my grandmother on the one hand, and then passing on the history to my 2 nietas.
All right. Do we have time? I know we have questions, but okay, we are fine. Huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
We have time, yeah.
So maybe you would like to read a little poem from because
Yeah.
these girls were mostly lovers of poetry and music. So there is a Spanish. Well, or you would like to sing it, maybe.
I'll sing one of the song that comes up frequently in the story. It kind of laces together the 4. I'll just try to sing it. And then if you all want to sing it with me, totally welcome to. So it's just a few lines from this song. En la mar hay una torre, en la torre una ventana, en la ventana una hija.
Isha, which is hija.
Which is hija, que a los marineros llama. I'm not a singer. In the sea there is a tower. In the tower there is a window. At the window, a daughter who calls to the sailors. Anybody, you want to try singing it with me? Some, yeah? I see some, yeah? Okay, let's try. En la mar hay una torre, en la torre una ventana, en la ventana una hija, que a los marineros llama. So that song comes in and out of the story, this idea of there's a girl in the tower in the middle of the sea. And it comes back to what you asked about freedom and independence and kind of seeking a freedom from that tower that comes up throughout the book.
Well,
yeah.
I want to emphasize how wonderful these exchanges I had with Ruth, including my interview in 2000, have been phenomenal for me. I learned so much from her, and we established a relationship that we haven't talked to each other in many years. It's there, when it comes from the heart. Yeah. But I want to emphasize this book is great reading for all ages, and it relates to the migration today as well as the one that Ruth is referring to, and intergenerational ties. And I would also like to say that Ruth would have liked to read a little bit from her book, but there is no time. But I'm sure you have questions. Yeah. So I want to thank Ruth for being here and telling you how much I enjoy being with you again. Ruth, I'm hoping you will come back. And I'll leave the floor open for questions.
Thank you, Anna. This has been beautiful. Thank you.
And she brought me to the wall and showed me a plaque. He was one of the founders of the Reformed congregation there. But anyway, I have a question about, for the holidays, do you have any traditions, family traditions or Cuban traditions that are different than what we might experience here for Passover, Seder, or any other holidays?
Well, for Passover, because we had both the Ashkenazi and Sephardic traditions, each Seder was different. One was an Ashkenazi Seder with gefilte fish and matzo ball soup, and the other one was the Sephardic Seder with stuffed grape leaves and other Turkish foods. So that was pretty much how we split it up. But it's always been Thanksgiving that we've made, interestingly, that we've made it the most Cuban of our holidays. So my mother's always made black beans and rice and tamales things like that, and sweet potatoes, the traditional American dishes, but then adding the Cuban. So it's really not so much in the Jewish holidays, but in our key American holiday, Thanksgiving, that we've incorporated a lot of Cuban traditions there. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, Ruth. I'm Hortensia Calvo. I'm the director of the Latin American Library here at Tulane. I'm so sorry we couldn't make it so you could come to the library. But I wanted to ask you about some of the books that we have there. We have some from the Ediciones Vigía that are artist books. And I know you have a long collaboration with Rolando Esteves, who was the artistic director, or he was the editor of Ediciones Vigía. Could you talk a little bit about the collaboration?
Absolutely. Thank you, Hortensia. Thank you.
There's a book that looks like a suitcase.
Yes. That is such an important part of my life. And unfortunately, Rolando Esteves just passed away a year ago. But he was a very, very dear friend and the artistic director of these handmade books from Cuba. And I was very involved with him and with the whole group at Ediciones Vigía. And that one book that you're referring to that has the suitcase on the cover, this was Esteves's view of me. He always viewed me as someone who was traveling and moving from place to place. And he had the idea of creating a book of my poems with the suitcase on the cover. And then you open up the suitcase, and inside are various elements, including a Jewish star inside the suitcase that references my Jewish identity. So he was a very important person in my life and in connecting me with Cuba and connecting me with the literary world in Cuba. And I participated with several books at Ediciones Vigía, and they really were the ones that nurtured my desire to write poetry and to write fiction. And I'm just so grateful to have had that connection with Esteves and with that amazing group in Cuba of Ediciones Vigía. I'm glad you have some of the books here at the library. That's really, really amazing. Yeah, thank you.
I want to say that we have some girls from the Jewish Day School, so thank you for coming. And if maybe one of the girls would have a question for the writer, would be awesome to have one of the girls ask a question. Yes,
there's more students.
You are also in the back. I see you. Yes, we would love to have a question from one of you. Anything you want to ask. And there was, while they think about it, there was somebody who raised her hand. Yes.
Hi, my name is Julia. I know you're originally an anthropologist. Do you see that affecting how you write fiction?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. No, I think absolutely. The two things are very connected for me. I feel grateful that I've had this long career as an anthropologist. It gave me the opportunity to spend time in Spain, Mexico, Cuba, Argentina, and other places, and to think about culture and heritage and diaspora and immigration. I mean, all of these topics, identity. So I'm really grateful to have had this long career in anthropology. But I also felt the need to write about things that I couldn't access through anthropology, that I couldn't access in a documentary form, the gaps in history, all, things like that, where I wanted to use my imagination. So I feel like I've gone on real journeys, and now I'm going on imaginative journeys, but the two definitely connect for me quite a lot. And I think anthropology gave me a lot of experience that I can now write about in my fiction. So I think the two are very interconnected for me.
Can we make it quick for one of the girls to ask her a question?
Of course.
Please.
If they'd like to.
What advice would you give to a young writer?
Do you have a question? Oh, one question at a time? Oh, okay. It's a joint question. It's a group effort, okay. What advice would I give to a young writer? Well, here's some advice. So definitely keep a notebook, start writing the things that are interesting to you, whether it's a story that you're thinking about or something exciting that happened to you. Start writing any of those experiences, and also listen to the stories of your elders, like talk to a parent or a grandparent or a great aunt or a great uncle, a neighbor, so listen to the stories of others. I mean, coming back to the earlier question, I think that's something that I learned through anthropology, was to be a very good listener because as anthropologists, we listen to other people's stories and write them down and really think about them. So listening to other people's stories is a great way to get ready to be a writer, because as a writer, you have to be able to write not just your story, but the stories of everybody around you. So that's what I would suggest, to just learn to be a really good listener and be interested in stories, your own stories and other people's stories as well.
Thank you for the question. Thank you,
Great
Ruth.
questions.
Thank you all for
Thank
coming.
you.